Police in Lebanon fired water cannons and tear gas on anti-government protesters. This after they tried to breach a security barricade outside government headquarters in the capital. Today's protest march began peacefully but saw a repeat of violence we have seen in recent weeks. Now, for more on the story, we can go across to our correspondent Molana-Allen standing by in Beirut for us. Leila, how have the protests looked today?
So the protests today started extremely peacefully. In a way, the protests as they've run today are a bit of a microcosm of how we've seen the protests over the last 100 days. Really, they started off this morning very peaceful, several marches from across the city coming down into the centre of town, waving flags, singing songs, some families there as well, something we haven't seen at these protests in quite a few days. They all congregated here in downtown Beirut, and they started first shouting at the banks. Of course, they're very angry at the banks here, and several have been destroyed in recent days. And then they marched back to where the protests all began 3 months ago, Riyadh al-Salah, just next to the parliament. And there are new barricades that have been erected there, and this is what was making protesters extremely angry. They've erected, the authorities have erected there these huge steel barriers all around those entrances, put extra new barbed wire on them. Already there's a concrete wall there as well, and already protesters have painted Lebanese flags on it and written graffiti on it. They've dubbed it the Wall of Shame because they say it's shameful that the authorities are reacting in this way to what they say are their legitimate demands for change in the country. So while many protesters tried to keep it peaceful, lighting candles, singing songs as the sun set, there was a large group of young men, about 100, who started trying to initially kicking all those walls, throwing stones at them, and eventually trying to rip them down in front of the Prime Minister's residence. They started ripping down the steel, they ripped off all the barbed wire, and that's when the water cannon started. It was continuous, that water cannon, and then they started releasing tear gas as well. They were all pushed to this area behind me, which is Martyrs Square, the scene of so many of those protests, violent clashes ongoing through that time, and eventually they came across here, being pushed by both riot police and the army, all down this road, as we've seen almost every day this week, and finally pushed down this road behind me. You can see the civil defence ambulances there who were responding to some injured. We don't have a figure on that yet, but hundreds of riot police and army out here tonight, hundreds of protesters too, but many of them now have dispersed after the high levels of tear gas. It really was thick in the air, and you might be able to see I'm quite red-eyed and snuffly. There's still a little bit of it left in the air, but things mostly calm at the moment. Whether there are going to be more of those violent protests tonight remains to be seen.
Now, Leila, it's been 100 days since the unrest began where you are. There's a new government that's been named, yet the protests continue. Why?
The protests do continue for a few reasons. The first reason is that protesters are saying that even though theoretically this government looks like what they have been asking for, which is a non-sectarian, non-elitist government of specialists chosen from people who are picked for their skills rather than for their political allegiances and not from the traditional political elites. Actually, when you start to look at their backgrounds, well, yes, a lot of them do have specialist skills. We have a lot of economists, we have a lot of engineers in this new cabinet, and none of them are existing politicians. They do, most of them have existing political affiliations. Friends with politicians, have worked for them in the past, have been their advisors. So actually many people saying this is a bit of a whitewash and it's not really the independent government people have been asking for. Also the fact that they were still chosen in the age-old way here of different sectarian parties choosing the ministers they wanted. That's why it took so long, the wrangling over this government to get a new cabinet. And the issue there is, meanwhile, this economic crisis that's been unfolding in Lebanon, people suffering more and more each day. The other day I was talking to a protester who said to me, this protest started 100 days ago because people are hungry. Now, 100 days later, they're hungrier still, they're poorer still. And the less you have to lose, the more you're willing to be violent and the more violence you're willing to take. That's what we've been seeing these last few days as I say, the protests continue. Smaller groups now, it's not the hundreds of thousands of families out in the streets that we saw before. It's now really these die-hard protesters who say that they will not move from the streets until they're actually given what they want, which is full reform. Others saying the new government should be given a chance. Hassan Diab, the new Prime Minister, says that he will answer their concerns, but for the moment protesters do not seem satisfied and are even more enraged by the reaction of the riot police and army here, who have been using these quite harsh measures against them the last few days: water cannon, rubber bullets, tear gas, and of course all these new barriers around Parliament, an institution that the people say should be for them, not for the politicians.
Leila, thank you very much for the update. Leila, Molana-Allen reporting there from Beirut.